Hello, welcome to this session. My name is Eleni Agouridi, and I will be the moderator. Well, let's hope that we will have a productive session this afternoon. Let me introduce the speakers in the order in which they will be speaking. First, we will be having our international speakers, Cathy Bartlett, who is Executive Director of the Global Education Fund, followed by Imad Sabi, Program Officer at Oxfam International, and also board member at the Global Campaign for Education. The two speakers will be followed by Artemis Zenetou, who is Executive Director of Fulbright Foundation, Greece, and last but not least, Vassilis Kourbetis, Head of the Office of European and International Educational Policy at the Institute of Educational Policy in Athens. With regards to the importance of quality education and its absence in Greece's educational system, as Anders Aslund mentioned earlier today, I would like to pose a couple of questions prior to the speakers' presentations, which could be addressed during their presentations or later on in the session. What constitutes quality education? How can quality education become accessible to an ever-increasing percentage of children worldwide? What factors differentiate the notion of education for people with disabilities? And finally, to what degree people with disabilities can and should be assimilated in the mainstream educational system? So I give the floor to Cathy Bartlett, and you have 10 to 12 minutes for your presentation.
Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Lots of new faces for me and a few old friends. So perhaps I would just start with saying that I'd like to reinforce something that Jerry said in the last session, which is there's a huge diversity across philanthropy and foundations. And I say this from a very personal perspective because I spent 20 years with Aga Khan Foundation and left them at the end of last year and now work for a much smaller global education fund based in Colorado. And in that move, I've had to do a lot of reflection and thinking about the role of different kinds of foundations and the particular niche that my new foundation is hoping to move in. It is a very new foundation. And I think you'll also see the diversity in our panel. The second point I would like to start with as part of my introduction is to say that while we are talking about philanthropy and education, for me it's very important to begin with the premise that education is a right, and therefore there are obligations of the state that need to be kept. The second part of that is that I think it's very hard for any state to do it all on their own, as the last panel said. And we do need to have collaboration and sharing and exchange. But if we believe that education is a right, and a right for all, then we have still quite a lot of work to do. So basically, I have two main points in the presentation, or I will try to stay to two main points. One is around equitable access, and you'll notice that I've inserted quality and relevant education. Because it seems to me that without quality and relevance, we have to ask what for. And it's important because we know that those that are left out, and Imad and I will both be touching on this, are the poorest, the most disadvantaged. Those are the ones who are yet out of the system or are leaving or being pushed out of education systems and any kind of learning. And then who's involved in education? And what's the potential within philanthropy and this proposed social welfare society, which I'm still getting my head around in terms of what it is, what it could be. Let me start with a couple of key, I think, important facts. One is that while the world community has embraced the idea of Millennium Development Goals and Education for All goals, we still have, 20, 30 years later, 57 million children, primary school-age children out of school, and 72 of sort of secondary, lower secondary age students out of school. So there are still millions out. In addition to that challenge, there are an estimated 250 million children who are in school at the primary level, but are really not gaining the basic skills that they need, not just the academic literacy, numeracy, but also the important other critical thinking, problem solving, interaction skills, life skills that they will need to be successful in life. So that's really reflects this issue of quality and relevance. There are many inadequate and unsafe learning environments. To me, those are elements of quality. There are very poorly supported and sometimes ill-prepared teachers. In Kenya, where I've been working for 20 years, when free primary education came in, classrooms bloomed in size. The good news is that more children were in school. The bad news is that a grade 1 teacher often had 150 children in front of her. So we have these tensions and challenges with us as we try to reach these goals of education for all. And then there's the issue of curriculum, which is sometimes outdated and often irrelevant. Again, this is particularly true in some of the countries that I'm most familiar with in Africa and Central Asia, where curriculum is often developed by ministries in urban settings and not necessarily taking into account the diversity of cultural, ethnic, religious, language backgrounds, rural, what's it mean to be a rural student in communities in their countries. So which kind of children and youth are we talking about? We hear 250 million children aren't learning, or 57 million are out of school. I want to try to help you put a face to some of these numbers. They're out of school. They're probably from very poor families. They are often ethnic and religious minorities. They may be immigrants or migrant families. Very many of them increasingly are in conflict and emergency situations. And there are other children who have special needs or disabilities. These are only some of the categories of what we mean by out-of-school children, excluded children from learning. So what are some of the other issues and trends that I see have been happening and seem to be coming up more in the future or currently? One is with the push for universal access to education as a right. Many government systems in Africa, again, I'm speaking primarily of Africa, South and Central Asia, where I've been working, and to some degree the Middle East. But in terms of government systems being overwhelmed with important positive policy changes on universal primary education, the teachers, the school infrastructure, just the diversity in the classrooms. And many times I've been in lower primary grade classrooms, for example, in Mozambique, in India, where you will have in a first grade classroom perhaps a child who's 4 or 5, as well as a child who's 12 or 13 or 14. Because the older ones have never had a chance to go to school, and they're put into the same classroom. So there's tremendous pressures on the system in terms of infrastructure and capacities and human resources that are overwhelming and that are incredible challenges for those governments to try to address. More recently, in a very recent report from UNESCO and the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, there is a noted decline in aid from the traditional bilateral, multilateral donors for basic education. This is worrying, given we still have these 57 million children out of school, and the other 72 million waiting who are interested in the lower secondary education side of things. So there's a worry in the broader education community about the decline in funding and financing of education. On the other hand, there seem to be, according to some reports, other private resources, and here I'm including corporate funds as well as NGO resources, as well as individuals. They are out there. One report I was reading from, make sure I get this correct, the Center for Philanthropy. It's a report on the global philanthropy and remittance from 2012, talks about literally billions of dollars going out from private sources. But most of this is going to health, and very little of it is going to education. As an example, they are saying something like $575 billion in 2010 from private capital investment, philanthropy, and remittances from donor countries to other countries. Now, those are primarily DAC countries that they are counting, and I think the numbers we have to be careful about, because it's always very hard to calculate these very precisely. But there are funds out there. The question is, where are they going, and who is accessing them, and who's benefiting from them? And I have to say, I'm not convinced that some of the most excluded and the poorest are the first ones on that list of those benefiting. But sometimes they are, and particularly in the case of NGOs. A more recent trend is there's a number of countries, certainly in Africa, where natural resources have been found, discovered, now being mined, accessed. One wonders what's going to happen with the wealth of those natural resources, and to what extent that can be placed to for education. So I think the last couple of slides I'd like to just focus on education and philanthropy. And here I would like to propose that philanthropy is, as the first panel I think was saying, for the most part, philanthropy cannot fill the gap of the role of the state. It can, however, support and many times has often supported the startup, the nurturing of ideas towards making education systems more effective, to looking at why certain populations are excluded and finding ways to address that. So what are approaches that are going to work for some of the excluded? And then finding ways to share that with government and other key education stakeholders. So I think one of the roles of philanthropy is about nurturing ideas and strategies by local leaders, by local social entrepreneurs, by local grassroots organizations, and supporting them as they work through solutions that are going to be appropriate in their different cultural contexts. So this is more of a bottom-up approach rather than top-down. I would say one of the things I've seen change over the last few years is that as the world of foundations has diversified and many more are entering, there are, I think, quite a number of foundations which are larger and more resourced that are looking at the scaling up side of these solutions and problems, the strategies that have been identified. On the other side are smaller foundations, such as the one I'm now working with, and I think where we've identified a niche is to continue to look for, at the grassroots level, ideas that are coming up that can be nurtured so that we don't stop a pipeline of thinking, reflection, responses, advocacy from the ground up, so that you begin to look for ways to meet those working at the state who have more resources, that are hoping to make that state system more efficient, more effective. But I think in my experience, I would say very strongly that we need bottom-up support so that there's an active, critical discussion, debate, reflection in education if we're really going to reach quality and relevance. So, and the very last thing I would want to stress is this issue, no matter who's involved in education, we all need to look at transparency and accountability. Foundations, governments, civil society, corporates, whoever is involved, we need to look at that transparency and accountability and really promote better learning and engagement and collaboration. And I would say, as a final positive note, that I do see some foundations really looking to work together to join swimming pools to where they have a common issue or worry, whether that's secondary education, whether that's early childhood. I think some of that is happening, but it needs to be promoted and I think pushed further. Thank you.
Imad, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Cathy, and I'm also more delighted than I can describe in words to be here in Greece at this conference. It's my first visit in this country, which means a lot to all of us. And in a way, we also partake in the destiny of this country, the way it deals with the crisis it is in, and we see it as our crisis as well. As a European citizen, as a global citizen, I think we do have a lot of stake in what is happening in Greece and how Greece comes out of the crisis. In my presentation, I want to speak about global trends in education. As you know, at the end of May, beginning of June, the high-level panel appointed by the UN Secretary General to formulate ideas on new global development goals published their report. The report contained 13 goals which the high-level panel proposes, and they are not only meant for developing countries, they are meant to be universal goals that apply to all countries. And the high-level panel report's third proposed goal is quality education and lifelong learning. That's how they formulated the goal. Now, how to put this in context? In the year 2000, in Dakar, an agenda was formulated called Education for All. It's a global development agenda, internationally agreed development goals, 6 of them, covering the whole spectrum from early childhood to adult education, life skills, adult literacy. And these were goals that were formulated to be achieved in 2015. In 2005, the Millennium Development Goals came. And the Millennium Development Goals had two education goals. MDG 2, which set the goal of achieving universal primary education by 2015, and MDG 3 on gender equity, which spoke about also eliminating gender disparity in primary and secondary schools. Notice that between the EFA agenda, the Education for All agenda, which was formulated in 2000, and the Millennium Development Goals, there is a shrinkage in terms of scope, in terms of the ambition, and in terms of the educational also sectors that are focused on. Well, where are we now in terms of achieving the MDGs, in terms of coming close to the goals set there? In terms of access to primary education, the figure now that we are looking at, a great deal has been achieved, but 61 million, 57 million children remain out of school. The situation is better with MDG 3 in terms of achieving gender parity. The high-level panel spoke about a global education, learning, and skills crisis. That's how they formulated the problem as they see it. The education crisis you can see in the fact that there are still 61 million children out of school. The skills crisis, which everyone talks about, unemployed youth. I mean, it's an issue relevant to Greece, to Spain, to countries in Europe, not only to the developing world. The skills crisis also indicates a huge number of young people and adults who lack adequate training and retraining and skills acquisition. The learning crisis, the figure Cathy mentioned, 250 million children going to school but not really learning. So these are the dimensions of the global education, learning, and skills crisis. Now, to respond to this crisis, the high-level panel is not the only multilateral, if you like, body looking at the issue. It has, as I said, formulated the goal as provide quality education and lifelong learning. There is another process which came out of the Rio Plus 20 conference on sustainable development. This is SDSN, and the way they formulate the education goal globally is ensure effective learning for all children and youth for life and livelihood. The Rio Plus 20 process has an open working group, and within that open working group there are different technical experts who have received briefs, and the one on education, the TST brief, the technical support team brief, formulates a goal as equitable quality education and lifelong learning. I mean, there are different points of emphasis between each of those. You would notice that the TST brief speaks about equity as a very important dimension. Now, what is happening is that we are forget about the slides because something got lost. We are setting globally more ambitious goals for education. Is the funding available to do that? Is there more funding coming to education? How are we going to deal with these figures? The out-of-school children, the children who have not really acquired learning at school, or the young people and the adults who are not also getting the right training for jobs with dignity. Well, the trend in terms of bilateral funding, as Cathy mentioned, is a drop in bilateral aid. And for the first time, in a decade, there has been a drop in the period 2010 and to 2011. So we are trying to set more ambitious goals, and we are really entering into fierce debates amongst ourselves in terms of what language to bring into these goals, what dimensions to add, and at the same time, there is, in addition to all the crises I mentioned, there is also a funding crisis. So there is a drop in bilateral aid. Where are the resources going to come from? One area that you can think of is maximizing domestic resources, and some of the earlier speakers touched upon this in the earlier panel. How do you maximize domestic resources in order to provide the needed resources for education? Another source are the new funders, the new emerging global powers, the members of the G20, the BRICS countries. And until now, there is no evidence that the BRICS countries are beginning to channel substantial funding to education. At the level of expressing aspirations and ambitions, they are all subscribing to the goal of supporting education at the global level, but this is not matched by funds. So that leaves the private sector and the philanthropy sector as another source. So what's the picture there? I'm going to try to find a slide. Yes, this one. The Brookings Institute researched the billionaire pledges. As you know, Warren Buffett and Bill Gates had this initiative, and they asked billionaires to make pledges that they would donate their money to philanthropy, to good causes. And the Brookings Institute did an analysis of the pledges that were made by billionaires in the US. And it's interesting to look at where the emphasis was. I mean, these are figures from 2010 on, how high on the agenda education was and how high global education was in contrast to domestic education. And you can see that there has been less of an interest in supporting global education and more supporting education at the domestic US level. But this is an indication of where the interests are. The Global Monitoring Report, which is an initiative by UNESCO, it's an independent monitoring body, and every year it issues a report and it looks at funding trends. And because there has been a great deal of talk about philanthropy funding as a significant new source for education, together with the Brookings Institute, I think they've looked at this, and what you can see here is that compared to bilateral donors, the contributions the philanthropy sector is making until now to global education, and taking into account omissions and inaccuracies, is still small. The largest foundation in terms of its contribution, the Open Society Foundation, comes between Switzerland and the Netherlands, yes, where I'm based. The Global Monitoring Report also raised an important issue. What are the motivations? Can we really put together all the foundations, all the corporate funding sector, and say the motivations are truly and fully altruistic? Or is there, in some cases, a mix between commercial interest and support to education? And this figure is from the Global Monitoring Report, where it indicates that in some cases there is a mix. So there is corporate funding for education, but it comes with also an agenda of interest. But I have to say that we are moving more and more also in the funding for education at the global level towards multi-stakeholder models. I sit on the Financial Advisory Committee of a multi-stakeholder forum which funds education globally called the Global Partnership for Education, which brings together donor countries, multilateral agencies, civil society, the private sector, and foundations. And in a way, that is the ideal model, because we sit there and we review country grant applications. All of us make pledges, and then we are able to monitor these pledges. And we do this in alignment with country priorities. So, if Senegal has a national education plan, it formulates that plan based on its priorities, and then it comes to the other donors, and we all see how we can support that process. So this is a model, I think, which harnesses the valuable contribution philanthropy can make, and at the same time puts it in an organizational form that allows it to dialogue and to align itself with the other actors as well. Another example, I think, of where foundations have been really charting a significant path forward is in the example of Roma exclusion in Europe, which is something we all should be shocked by as Europeans. I mentioned that the Education for All agenda was set to achieve education for all goals by 2015. The European Union set the very modest goal of having Roma children achieve primary school by 2020, 5 years beyond the goal that is set for global education. Foundations in Europe have actually played a significant role in problematizing that issue, in focusing attention on it, and in pushing the European Union and national governments in Europe to take up that agenda, which I know is also an issue here in Greece. So these are cases where we feel philanthropic initiatives can make a significant contribution to education. Thanks very much, and I hope that the question and answer session later would allow us to really expand and talk more about all those issues. Thanks.
Artemis is next.
Thank you, Eleni. You've done a magnificent, you had a magnificent role actually in coordinating us, because it's one of the few conferences that I had the chance actually to meet via phone with all the participants and discuss the session. So I think that was a great benefit. And appreciation to the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for initiating and sustaining the dialogue. I think it was about a decade ago that I was invited to present at the New York Public Library. It was an eye-opener, indeed. This was an excellent forum that the Niarchos again had organized and brought us together for networking purposes and to meet several grantees from many countries. And I can say now, about 10 years later, that a number of new collaborations did stem out from that meeting. It was one of the times that I kept on hearing the term strategic philanthropy, which is frequently used by foundations to deal with complex issues that require long-term approaches. But of course, there are urgent and severe issues, and their impact on individuals and communities is so immediate that it has to be dealt instantly. The Stavros Niarchos has really led by example both locally and globally. Our topic today, accessible education for all, is more of sort of like long-term strategic goals. We many times use at Fulbright the sort of like saying from Senator Fulbright that education is a slow-moving but powerful force. It may not be fast enough or strong enough to save us from catastrophe, but it is the strongest force available. We were talking earlier, the first two speakers, on sort of like more global policy issues. I'm going to talk to you briefly about a global program, the Fulbright, with local action and things that we've done to sort of like make education accessible to all. You will allow me a few minutes just to do a brief introduction to the Fulbright program. It is a program which is highly competitive, merit-based, grants for international educational exchange for students, scholars, teachers, professionals, scientists, and artists that was founded by a US senator, Senator Fulbright. And just for the record, someone who was born in 1905, and he himself became a Rhodes Scholar and thought that that was a prime example for him to establish a similar program in the United States. At the age 30, he became probably the youngest ever president of an American university at the University of Arkansas. And from 42 to 1975, he was serving in politics, elected in the US Senate, and in 1946 established the Fulbright program through legislation. It's a global program, and this year we're celebrating about 65 years. Greece takes pride in operating the oldest program, Fulbright program in Europe, and the second oldest in the world. In your catalog, that it has a brief description of my presentation, you will excuse a typo that it was my mistake. Up to date, we have awarded more than 5,000 grants, not 500 grants. So that's important just for the sake of history and activity that has taken place over the years. 155 countries, one vision, which is education accessible for all. About 8,000 exchanges per year. And I would say that Fulbright remains today as vibrant, innovative, and relevant as it was at its beginning. It has been described as one of the largest and most significant movements of scholars across the face of the earth. And it operates in 155 countries, as I said, and 8,000 exchanges per year. What Fulbright does, it addresses global challenges, advancing knowledge, building community, fostering mutual understanding, empowering future generations. The Fulbright Foundation in Greece develops future leaders with international skills and cross-cultural capacity. To date, more than 5,000 grants have been awarded to both Greek and American citizens. The binational approach is the hallmark that distinguishes the Fulbright academic program from most exchange programs, either private or public. It was established in 1948 through a binational treaty between the US and Greece. While support from both the US and the Greek government secures the basis of operation, the growth of the program relies on private, also cooperative support from individuals, corporations, and institutions in both countries. When the program started back in 1948, there was a tremendous need in Greece to educate a large part of the population. A number of the problems that were very current at that time are resurfacing now, about 65 years later, in many different shapes and forms. What we have been trying to do through our programs is, with minimizing finances and minimizing resources, to be able to maximize results. And this has brought to life a new way of thinking, of resourcefulness, learning new ways to approach, and sort of like developing a program which is accessible to all, but providing equal access to quality education. One of the problems in the exclusion that we mentioned earlier is the exclusion of people from information, simply because they do not have the means to get to the source of the information. And one of the programs that we developed that we thought it was sort of like had the multiplier effect was a modest program of educating educators. A professional development for educators. We started modestly about 15 years ago, sending about 2 educators Greek educators per year to the United States to develop skills about curriculum development that we were talking earlier, classroom technologies, multi-classroom, multiculturalism in the classroom, different ways of educating the kids based on different learning abilities. This program gradually grew, and we were able about 4 years ago, through a grant from the US Department of Education, to select 19 educators from across Greece. And what is interesting to mention briefly is how this selection takes process. Because one would argue, but do you really reach out to every single part of the country? What are the means of sort of like presenting this information? Because there are able students and able teachers throughout the country. The thing is, like, how do we reach out to them? And this is really one of the strengths of the program. First of all, we're utilizing an amazing core of alumni that are based throughout the country, and also reaching out through not only the official channels of the Ministry of Education, but through local libraries, through the network of educators that are really becoming the trainers of the next generation of trainers. This program that started with 19 educators has now, almost 4 years later, grew to a program of about 200 educators that have been educated and trained by this core network. It's a pleasure really to be able to see how many more students from public schools are reaching out to Fulbright, because that's also what's essential, to have people coming. You're reaching out to people, but how much do people know about you through different ways, and how much access do they have to you? In the last 2 years, we have seen a tremendous growth. I don't know whether it's only because of the crisis that a lot of more people want to leave Greece, which is for the wrong reasons, unfortunately, but we have seen a tremendous increase on students that have been basically informed and sensitized about further studying from their educators, a phenomenon that we had not seen in the previous years. So what I would argue as one of the strongest programs that we have is the training opportunities for Greek educators, both in elementary and secondary schools, that later on have the multiplier effect in developing a dynamic constituency with very limited funding. Because one would argue, how can you really find secure funds on a yearly basis to be able to develop new networks? The thing is, how can we utilize through our current resources of educated people in many different parts of the country in bringing out the best? So the trainers multiplier effect is something that I think will be easier to discuss over our examples later on. Another new program was the Opportunity Funds to facilitate access to U.S. higher education for academically talented but economically disadvantaged students. One of these ways was through the initiation of a summer program on social entrepreneurship that basically the first candidate was elected this summer. This is, again, a very modest program, and it started through the network of educational advisors and professors in various universities throughout the country, that they were the ones basically that recruited students because they have the best access to education potentially challenging students that could be able to meet these goals. So this year, we're proud to say that a young, amazing student from Aristotle University was selected as the first recipient in a pan-European competition to attend the program on social entrepreneurship at Indiana University. What we're hoping to do after the return of this student, and since we are able to secure a few more grants for the next years, is to create a student-to-student network where students actually can reach out to their peers and mobilize and inform of opportunities, because opportunities are out there. The thing is, like, how do people learn about the opportunities that exist? Another way of reaching out to our audience is through the municipal libraries and American Spaces, that municipal libraries throughout the country, and American Spaces, that is an initiative of the Educational and Cultural Department of the U.S. Embassy. And earlier on today, we found out about the program of the Future Library that the Niarchos Foundation is doing. This is one of the ways that we're hoping through the next year that we're going to be able to have access to the local communities and to educators throughout the country through the libraries, which are usually different kinds of audiences that would go to be able to find out about programs that are offered through the Fulbright Foundation and programs through other universities in the United States. Because although there are certain requirements for someone to be able to get a Fulbright scholarship, one of the very powerful programs that the Foundation is offering is the educational advising, which is a free service for education for all, regardless whether one meets the criteria or not to receive a scholarship, and on any kind of topic and field. We're trying at least to give the tools to people that wouldn't have them and make them able to select a better future, giving young people the tools and knowledge to realistically plan for their futures. Thank you.
So we're moving from a global program fostering excellence in education to the challenging issue of special education, examining the Greek case, which always remains a topical issue. Vassilis, the floor is yours.
Okay. Is anybody in this room that cannot see the slides? Is anybody in the room that cannot hear me? Is anybody in the room that cannot understand what I'm saying? This is going to be a very accessible 15 minutes. When you hear the duck, it means that my half of the time is up. I'm very glad to be here, and very glad to talk about very important right, as Cathy said, because if education is a right, it should be a right for all. As you have the right to have an interpreter, or if you could not see, to have somebody to describe what is it that I'm going to put up on the screen. It's a right to go to school and be able to have access to education as anybody else. Access in education does not mean only RAMs or technical information. It means access to everything. And the word systematic, it's systemic actually. It's the key to that. Usually we're talking about accessibility and we talk about one part of it and we feel good about it, that we've done something accessible. I'm wondering, from where you are, especially the people in the back, can you see what is it that says over the right bottom corner above Institute of Education Policy? You see, sometimes the environment is the one that makes you disabled and not some disability that somebody might have. In that sense, the whole world has actually voted a convention, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It's implemented right now in Greece. It's a law 4074 of 2012. It was voted one day before the last year's election. That says something about it. Also says something why that page that you see, it's crooked. Actually, a colleague of mine that I gave her to have a look at my English, because English is not my native language. She says, wait a minute, you put the wrong picture on it. No, that's not the wrong picture. That is a picture from the National Gazette, the Εφημερίδα Κυβερνήσεως. That's the law. That's how it's actually printed. Now, Article 49 in the same convention says that it has to be accessible in an accessible format. I guess we started on the wrong foot because it's a very simple and inexpensive implementation to make it accessible. We actually have a PDF that is crooked. We don't have it in an accessible format, in a Word, let's say. But we're not the only ones. Only 4 countries out of the 55 country survey have the convention in an accessible format, in an audio version, in sign language translation of the country, or plain language version, as the convention that somebody signed requires. Actually, when I read that, 2 days later, I found that the people from the Zero Project, the report, are actually presenting in the next room. They've done an excellent job, by the way. What is important here is to look at one part of the convention that talks about education. That's Article 24. It's a one-page article, but in sum, it says that persons with disabilities can access an inclusive, quality, and free primary education and secondary education on an equal basis with others in the communities in which they live. There are two questions here. Are all schools accessible? Is every child able to exercise that right, like Cathy said? The answer is no. But we have to do something about it, and we have to start somewhere. The Institute of Educational Policy, it's a brand new institute that replaced 4 other institutes due to the economic crisis that we all know, which is, by the way, as Imad said, the education crisis is the one that is more important. And the reason is, once you're done with it, you get out of the education crisis, you don't go back. And the economic crisis is a circle. Once all girls go to school, then the next generation is definitely going to go back to school, except if there is a great disaster of some sort, which then everything goes to hell. We try to do some very innovative practices, which in the end are going to become policies. So where do we start? From the UN Convention. Our goal is to implement it as far as the education is concerned, where we want to remove all the barriers, and I'll show you how we do it. All books are done, excuse me for this, for the medium, for the down the street person. You have to have hands that can open the book. You have to be able to see it. You have to be able to understand it. And you have to have the previous conditions that tell you that will give you the right to exercise that right. We actually taking, starting from the beginning, from kindergarten, nursery schools, and first and second grade, and we're actually making all the teaching packages. The ones that come from abroad know that our curriculum is, we have a main curriculum in Greece, and all the books are derived from that curriculum, and they're the same, either a kid goes to school in Athens, or in Santorini, in a private school, or in a public school. We try to make those, that material accessible to deaf kids through sign language, Greek Sign Language that is, to children with visual problems, either with enlarged print or braille, and everything else that goes with it, as far as pictures is concerned, and all the rest of the books, that the books have a problem, that we have a problem with the books as far as accessibility is concerned. In plain language, for children that go to mainstream schools, to everyday general schools, that the goal of the curriculum, as Artemis said earlier, is one, but it can be diversified. And we're also using alternative ways of meeting the goals of the curriculum. Half of my time is up. Except that, in order for a child to go to school in a regular school, as the convention says, we have special kids like deaf children and blind children, or children with visual problems. For deaf children, 95% of them have hearing parents, which means they don't know sign language. They come to school with no sign language skills. We're developing educational material to teach Greek Sign Language as a first language and then teach Greek as a second language in school. And also learning material for sign language readiness, because all kids come to school ready to go to school. They know more than 6,000 words on their vocabulary. They know the grammar of, that is used in the books. Children that come from deaf families or hearing families not necessarily know that, and you cannot teach Greek with Greek. You cannot teach the unknown with the unknown. For children with visual problems, even though we required our teachers to know Braille, up to now we do not have material to teach Braille to kids. We have a child in Anafi, one of the smallest islands in Greece. The child is blind. We send a teacher that knows Braille. The child does not know Braille, so somebody has to teach it, and you have to have materials in order to do that. Also, orientation, mobilities, and everyday life skills. We're designing and we provide to schools material that is accessible to children, and because IT is the future, we're designing a platform to have all that material accessible. Money well spent has to be well used. And we spend a lot of money developing material throughout the years, but unfortunately, they're not used because people cannot find them. We're actually collecting all that material in order to be accessible to teachers and children and parents. And as Artemis said, educating the educators might be one of the most important things. So once we're done with that project, we're going to, and we are in the process actually right now, of training the trainers, training teachers, special education teachers, general education teachers, school counselors, in a needs service type of training, not like this. Because in sessions like this, you really cannot do all those things that you cannot use them correctly, you will. You can follow us as to what we do in that page. Prosvasimo in Greece means accessible. A last word for the foundation, the role of the foundations. Historically, I could tell you this, I could not be here talking to you if it was not for a foundation. I'm a scholar from the Onassis Foundation. I could not pay for BU. Boston University is a very expensive school, and I come from a very poor village. So I bet back then, if they were to see if that was cost effective, as was said earlier, nobody could actually measure it. But new ideas, yes, let's come up, as Cathy says, with something new. The government does this with money that coming from the Greek government or the European Union. Who is going to do the Bible accessible? I see three priests here that I'm sure they can understand the value of having the Bible accessible to all disabled children. Who would do taboo issues like sex and drugs, sex education? We're not going to do it because we're too conservative to do it. But a foundation could do it. And everything in between that, as far as children's books, all the ways to TV shows, or everything that an obstacle is there. I want to thank you very much for your attention. Before the duck start talking, I cover my time. I was on time, that is. And of course, I will be more than glad to answer any questions later. Thank you.
Well, I would like to thank all the speakers for their very interesting presentations. Unfortunately, we're running really out of time. We need to be finished in 12 minutes, I was informed. I was planning to briefly elaborate on a couple of examples of the SNF grant making, which are indicative of what we try to do at a foundation level towards increasing accessibility to education for people of all backgrounds. But I'm afraid that I won't be able to do that. I will ask the speakers who come from different backgrounds and countries to ask each other questions if they have any urgent questions. Otherwise, I will give the floor to the audience.
I'd rather hear from
Okay, sure.
Τα διαπιστευτήριά μου καταρχάς, ονομάζομαι...
I'm Anastos Dimitropoulos. I'm chairman of the Hellenic Benefactors Society. We're exploring the work of benefactors since antiquity. Mr. Sabi, the dimension of altruism, the dimension of the benefactors in ancient Greece, is it similar to what happens in the US today? And is compulsory benefaction in ancient Greece, is it a different concept or it is close to current phenomena of benefactors? And then special education, civic education about democracy and benefaction and etc. Does this exist? Does this special education exist in the Greek system or in European education? Thank you.
To hear more questions. You'd like to? Okay.
Thank you. My question is for Imad Sabi. You rightly mentioned the great problem of youth unemployment. There are 3 countries in Europe that have solved that problem. Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, that don't have more unemployment among youth and among the rest of the population. And this is clearly because of apprenticeships. What's your attitude to apprenticeships? Do you think that this is something that should be advocated on a big scale, or do you have any objections to it? Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Ivan Jurek from Jonas Latzis Public Benefit Foundation. I guess my question goes to Cathy and Imad mainly, but also Mr. Kourbetis, who's covering the disability section. I think a problem that education's facing is that the sector itself has a problem categorizing needs. Aside from what happens in the classroom, what happens in the environment in the country impacts what's going to go on in the schools, how kids get there, how parents force their children to go to school or prevent them from going to school or engage with teachers, with the educational facilities in a country. This is very culture specific. So in Africa, it's going to be wildly different to various European countries and wildly different to various Latin American countries. So all these extra factors impact on funding as well, whether it is for the government or foundations. And a holistic approach seems to be necessary to tackle educational issues that other factors that impact it. And the second question relates to specificity and defining the problems. Approaches to special needs vary so wildly as well. So there's a dramatic difference between blind and deaf children and the educational strategy in solving problems there, as opposed to Down syndrome and low-functioning autism spectrum disorders, which could be classified as something that belongs more to health or maintenance or palliative care, as opposed to following a curriculum and going to university. So where you get funding from, whether it's foundations or government, will depend on how you categorize and class a problem. Thank you.
Who would like to go first? Imad?
Well, thank you for those questions. I'll start with Professor Aslan's question on youth training. Indeed, there are countries which have developed successful models, but then these countries also have very successful economies. You know, part of the problem in discussing youth unemployment and skills training is that an assumption is sometimes made that the problem is in the education sector, as if the economy has jobs and it's a question of getting the education system to provide the kind of training that the economy needs. And that, I think, is sometimes an unbalanced way of looking. You know, Germany has a strong economy and has been able to tailor its vocational training and youth training to the needs of its economy in a way that is mutually beneficial and mutually strengthening. And I think, of course, you know, this is something that we need to look at. How is that problem being tackled here in Greece? I mean, it's something I wish we had a chance to look at. I know, you know, the foundations here are looking at that issue. But in terms of whether, you know, the education campaigners support that as a goal, they do, because there is a skills crisis, but it needs to be looked at in a multifaceted way. That's what I would say. On the question of benefactors and altruism, you know, this is an issue that I'm sure that the motivation for many foundations is truly altruistic. But looking at the overall picture of education funding, there are also corporate funders who have a stake, a commercial interest in education, and that's where the lines are blurred. And it's important for us to distinguish, I think, between philanthropic foundations which provide support to education without expecting any gains, and so they do this fully independently, and those whose motivations are a bit more complex.
I wanted to go back to the question on linking apprenticeship training and unemployment, because earlier on with the panel we were discussing whether in Greece, in fact, we're directing all of our children to higher education at the university level, whether we should be looking actually to developing technical skills and looking sort of like at agriculture and other means that really are important for the Greek economy. So perhaps that could be something interesting that we could discuss with the audience. Are we providing and steering our young to the right direction? Should everyone go to the university?
On the second question, in terms of the broader learning environment, I mean, there are absolutely various factors that affect learning, and it begins with, for example, nutritional status of children when they go to school. Have they eaten? Are they suffering from malaria? There are many, so there are those sorts of health and nutrition factors. There are absolutely other culturally related factors that might prevent girls or special needs children from going to school, from learning. And in my experience, I think the solutions really are what I was saying before. It really needs to be an engagement of a discussion with the parents and communities, preferably with the students, though when they're preschoolers that might be slightly difficult, and with educators. And I think I've seen too often a barrier, a wall between formal schools in many of the countries I'm working with and parents and communities. And so the lack of engagement means there can be misunderstanding. Why didn't you send your child to school? How do you define quality? In some places, the first thing they ask about is the safety of the children going to school. And that's a very logical question in many of the contexts. So I think we need more engagement, and I do feel that NGOs, as well as foundations, can help to be a bridge and create channels for discussion and mediation. But it really requires different stakeholders, not just a formal education system making the decisions. And if I might add on the apprenticeship, I think it's a really important question that you ask. And I would sort of add on to the last point. I feel that so many systems have taken Western systems sort of full on without realizing that jobs and employment are beyond what happens inside the classroom, that they need practical, relevant skills that are going to take them forward, that they need to be able to engage with their employers. So I feel that there's that part of the question in terms of the view of apprenticeship, because many of certainly in Africa, Asia, apprenticeship was a traditional thing. You had crafts and but the other side is whether or not it's valued on both the education side and on the parent side. So I think we need to bring that back in and ensure some guards where there are also problems with child labor. So taking that into account, I think we need to look much more carefully at how to use apprenticeship for youth in particular.
As far as culturally biased, definitely I'm covered from everybody else, but culturally biased, you can have an educational system that you see a child with disabilities as a punishment from God, all the way to as an equal to everybody else. But within countries, especially since you mentioned the deaf, we're talking about a whole totally different culture, especially parents that they're deaf or parents that they're hearing. And bringing practices from other cultures to countries that they don't have them, only disasters can come. You can see practices from different countries, like Italy, for example, that in one night, they shut down the special educational system in one day. Of course, here we can shut down something else in one day, but I wouldn't be, if you were to take integration, for example, into a regular, everyday, mainstream school, that they're an inclusion is the right word, an inclusive system, as the UN Convention says. You cannot do it in Greece right now. In Canada, you can do it because the rule is if a child breathes, goes to the regular school, period. If you do it here, you'll destroy the whole system and you won't be serving anybody else. So cultural factors are definitely have to come to be taken care on decision making and policy making. You have to seriously look into them. Now, the question of democracy, I'll say only on that, and I'll try to answer it this way. Define democracy any way you want. Special education is the antonym of democracy. Unfortunately, on everyday life, if you're a parent of a child with disability, or if you're disabled yourself, any kind of disability, you feel the lack of democratic practices on a daily basis. So any civil courses or teaching or part of the curriculum, it's useless, because you have something more strong than that. You can define the lack of democracy on everyday issues.
Is there any last question? No? Okay, well, I would like to thank everyone for the speakers and everyone who attended the sessions. Thank you.